Deputy Boyd Barrett. 5 minutes each. I want to raise the question of Palestine and the EU's relationship with Israel. I know that it was on the agenda to the extent, goodbye Taoiseach, regular departure once Solidarity People Before Profit starts to speak. It's
4 hours, how long do you do?
but have you ever stayed for any of our contributions on any of the debates that you lead off on? No. Every single European Council debate he stays until Labour speaks with their 7 TDs, as he rightly should, and then Solidarity People for Profit with our 6 TDs. Our ideas are not worth listening to. I'm sure he can read the transcript.
I don't get the point.
No, he should also stay to listen to you, absolutely. He should stay to listen to what people have to say in terms of these debates where the Taoiseach leads off on them. Obviously the question of Jerusalem was on the agenda of the European Council meeting, and to the extent that the European Union isn't the US, to the extent that they're not Donald Trump in enthusiastically endorsing and cheering on Israeli oppression, for example with the move of the US Embassy, the EU can try to bask in kind of an inverted, reflected glory of not being Donald Trump and somehow look as if they're friends of the Palestinian people. But the reality is very, very different than that. Yes, they have a different approach in terms of how they put it forward, how they're happy to have crocodile tears for Palestinians. But the same complicity exists between the European Union and Israel and is deepening the relationship between EU and Israel at the moment as we speak and over the last couple of months in particular. And there's been a very graphic demonstration of why that's absolutely abhorrent, morally wrong, outrageous as a foreign policy, which is the treatment of the 16-year-old Ahed Tamimi over the course of the last couple of months. She is a Palestinian activist. She's a recognised human rights defender who was arrested in the early hours of the 19th of December. Her mother was detained on the same day when she went to a detention centre to ask of her whereabouts. She was taken from her home by Israeli soldiers into a military jeep and has since then and still is being held in a military prison, Ofer prison. One day prior to arrest, she was protesting against occupation soldiers who shot her cousin, 14-year-old, in the face, who was then in a critical condition. During the raid, soldiers forcibly entered her home. They physically assaulted her mother and her siblings. They confiscated electronic devices, including laptops, cameras and mobile phones. Her treatment comes after her challenging the presence of the Israeli Defence Forces in her family's courtyard following that injury of her 15-year-old cousin. The village that she lives in has been the location of regular protests in which she has played a role in, because it is exactly illustrative of the creeping, or like more than creeping, growing occupation, forcing people out of their homes. For example, in this area, with the water being redirected to a local Israeli settlement, leading to a lack of water to the Palestinian farms. She faces 12 charges in a military court, which have grown over a period of time as a result of her being involved in protests. The reaction of the right wing is absolutely appalling. The Education Minister stated that she should end her life in prison, and the point is she's still in prison now. Her mother is still in prison. She should be released, but they illustrate a fact which is the treatment of Palestinian children by the Israeli occupation, where 8,000 have been arrested, detained or charged with offences of military courts since the year 2000, and where 3 out of 4 of them detained by the IDF experience violence, and they face conviction rates in what are military courts of 99%. When I was in Gaza 7 years ago, I saw some of the instruments of torture used against these children. But what's the reality of the relationship between the EU and Israel? It's demonstrated by a so-called informal meeting at the end of December between all of the EU foreign affairs ministers with Benjamin Netanyahu. An incredible relationship that wouldn't happen for anywhere else, and exactly illustrates the fact that with the EU-Israel Cooperation Agreement, Association Agreement, that Israel is incorporated into the single market, and the fact that Israel and Israeli companies, including military companies, have been the beneficiaries of almost $2 billion over the last 20 years in research funding, which is public funding, some of which ends up with those arms industries. That relationship has to end. Ahed Tamimi and her family must be released immediately.